My name is Ava Monroe. I'm 28 years old, and tonight I'm standing in the middle of the ballroom at the Waldbridge Hotel in Manhattan, dressed in a midnight blue gown and holding a glass of champagne that suddenly tastes bitter. Across the room, my stepmother is laughing lightly with the board of directors, pretending she doesn't know why security is making their way toward me. She said I must have slipped in through the staff entrance, told the event planner that I probably wanted to feel important for once in my life. She smiled when she said it, smiled like she was being generous with her pity. But I knew what she was doing. The crowd around us is too polite to stare directly, but I can feel the shift in energy as people glance at me over their drinks. I can almost hear them thinking it. Who is she? What is she doing here? Did she really crash the gala? And for a moment, I can't breathe because this is exactly what Meredith wanted. A public shaming dressed up as a misunderstanding. But what no one here knows, not the woman I used to call family, not the security guard now asking if I have an event badge, is that the anonymous donor who funded this entire night is on his way through those glass doors. And I'm not just his guest. I'm his wife. I took his name in private, but I kept my father's name in public because it's all I had left. Lucas told me I didn't need to come, that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, but I wanted to stand here and face her with my chin up and my hands steady just once. Not to fight, not even for revenge. Just to feel what it's like to hold power in a room where they once made me feel invisible. So if you've ever been made to feel small by the people who were supposed to love you, or if you've ever walked into a room knowing they were hoping you'd break stay with me, you're going to want to hear what happened next. I was 9 when my mother died. One day she was humming while folding laundry, and the next she was in a hospital bed too tired to speak. Cancer moved fast. I didn't understand most of what was happening, but I understood what it meant when Dad stopped shaving and forgot to put milk in my cereal 3 mornings in a row. For a while, it was just the two of us trying to hold each other up without knowing how. He went back to work too soon, and I went back to school too quiet. At night, I'd listen for his footsteps in the hallway, hoping he might peek in like he used to, just to make sure I was okay. He stopped coming by after a while. I told myself he was tired, that he missed her too much. I didn't want to be another thing he couldn't fix. I got good at pretending I was fine. I set my alarm, I made my own lunches, I did my homework without being asked, I learned how not to need too much. Then Meredith came along. She worked in finance, knew how to host a fundraiser, and had the kind of smile that made grown men lean in closer. I remember the first time she came to dinner. She brought dessert, wore a red scarf, and called me sweetheart, like she'd known me forever. I remember thinking maybe she was the kind of person who filled in cracks without leaving seams. Meredith had a daughter too, Chloe. She was my age, but she wore perfume and talked like she was 20. She had perfect teeth and ballet trophies and called her mom by her first name. When Dad introduced us, Chloe barely looked at me before asking if we had cable upstairs. At first, I tried to be excited. I told myself it would be nice to have a sister, someone to sit with on the school bus, someone who'd maybe braid my hair or whisper secrets under the covers during a thunderstorm. For a while, I tried. I asked her to draw with me. She said crayons were for babies. I offered to show her my favorite books. She rolled her eyes and said she didn't do stories without pictures. Still, I kept hoping. Even when Dad remarried and we moved into a bigger house, even when Chloe got the bigger bedroom, and I was told that it made sense because her furniture wouldn't fit in the smaller one. Even when Meredith insisted I call her Mir instead of Mom because she said that title belonged to someone else. The little differences were easy to ignore at first. Chloe got new riding boots while I wore the same sneakers for 3 years. She got a full birthday party at an equestrian center. I got takeout and a cake from the store. Chloe's paintings were framed in the hallway. Mine disappeared after a few weeks. When I mentioned it to Dad, he said I was imagining things. That Meredith was trying her best, that Chloe just needed more support right now. He promised things would even out, but they didn't. Family game nights happened when I had art class. Dinner reservations always seemed to conflict with my student gallery showings. Whenever I asked if we could reschedule, Meredith would sigh and tell me not everything revolved around my hobbies. Dad stopped looking at the calendar. He started looking at Meredith like she knew something he didn't. I didn't throw tantrums or argue. I just stopped asking. I got good at fading into the background. They didn't notice when I started skipping dinner or when I sat alone in the car during Chloe's weekend recitals. Meredith told the neighbors we were all adjusting so well. I nodded when people asked how I liked having a sister. I think the hardest part wasn't what they said. It was how quiet the shift was. like someone dimming the lights a little more each day until one morning you wake up and realize you're sitting in the dark, and no one remembers turning the switch. Even when things hurt, I told myself to be grateful. I had a roof, I had food, I wasn't being hit or screamed at. The world teaches you early that some kinds of pain don't count unless they come with bruises. But emotional neglect leaves marks too. They're just invisible to everyone but you. By the time I turned 15, I'd stopped trying to belong in that house. I lived there, but I wasn't part of it. Not really. I kept my door closed and my head down. I started working after school saving money even though I didn't know what for yet. Some nights I'd hear laughter from the kitchen, the kind that used to be ours. And for a second, I'd wish I could go back and freeze time before everything got rearranged. Before my mother died. Before my father forgot how to see me. Before love started coming with conditions I never agreed to. It started with the bathroom. Chloe and I were supposed to share the one in the hall, but Meredith said Chloe needed privacy. She said teenage girls needed their own space, and since Chloe had dance practice and early mornings, I was asked to use the guest bathroom downstairs. At first, I didn't argue. It didn't seem like a big deal, but then Chloe's name appeared in cursive letters on the door, and suddenly that hallway bathroom felt like hers, alone. The guest bathroom was cold and had no natural light. The shower pressure was weak, and the cabinet was always stocked with travel-sized shampoo no one used. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a bathroom. Then Christmas came and Chloe's gifts spilled out across the living room. Designer perfume concert tickets, a leather bag with her initials embossed on the front. I got 3 things: a pair of slippers, a generic sketchbook, and a scarf that still had the sale tag attached. Meredith clapped her hands and said we were lucky girls. Dad smiled and asked if we liked everything. Chloe beamed and kissed their cheeks. I nodded and hugged my sketchbook a little tighter than I needed to. There were photos taken that day. Chloe in front of the tree, Chloe with Dad and Meredith Chloe, and the dog in matching sweaters. I stood behind the camera for most of them. No one asked me to be in the frame. At school, Chloe was always picked up in the newer car. Meredith made her lunch with little notes tucked inside. My lunch money got forgotten more than once, and when I brought it up, Meredith said I was old enough to handle those things myself. I tried not to let it get to me. I studied harder, got a job shelving books at the library, and spent hours sketching in the margins of my notebooks. But even when I worked for what I wanted, it felt like I was being punished for not needing them. One afternoon, Meredith found a flyer for my school's art show crumpled on the counter. She asked why I hadn't mentioned it. I told her I did. She looked past me and asked Chloe if she wanted to go shopping that night. Chloe said she needed new boots. Meredith nodded and turned back to her phone. Dad missed the show too. He said something came up at work. I stood in the school hallway alone, waiting for faces that never arrived, telling myself it was okay. At least my name was printed on the wall next to my painting. I used to think if I was quieter, easier, more agreeable, they would notice me again. But the more invisible I became, the easier it was for them to forget I was ever there in the first place. There was no big explosion, no screaming matches or slammed doors, just a slow slide into absence, like someone editing me out of the family in real time, one tiny decision at a time. By the time I turned 16, Chloe's voice echoed through the house while mine stayed in my throat. Meredith told people she had 2 daughters, but she only introduced one. The other one just learned how to disappear without making a sound. My dad used to be the one person who saw me. When I was little, he'd hold my hand during parent-teacher nights and tell everyone I was the smartest girl in the room. He'd show my drawings to his coworkers and say I got my creativity from my mom. But somewhere along the way, he stopped looking at me that way. I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe it was when Meredith started organizing his calendar or when Chloe started calling him Dad, like she'd always belonged. He didn't mean to pull away. It was more like he got tired. He came home later, talked less, and sat through dinners without noticing that I barely spoke. Meredith filled in the silence with wine and polite laughter, and Chloe filled it with stories about school that I wasn't part of. I told myself he was just stressed, that work had become overwhelming, that it wasn't me he was pulling away from, just the noise. I clung to scraps of attention, like the time he brought me a new sketch pad or asked about my favorite artist when Meredith wasn't around. The last real memory I have of him is the night I got into my top college. He said he was proud. He looked me in the eye and said I'd do amazing things. I believed him. I wish I hadn't. He died 2 weeks before finals, a heart attack at his office. No warning, no goodbye. Meredith handled the funeral arrangements. Chloe picked out the flowers. I just sat there numb, trying to remember what his voice sounded like when it was just for me. The reading of the will was held in a quiet legal office that smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. Meredith cried into a tissue. Chloe looked bored. I tried not to hope for anything. I really did. But hope has a way of sneaking in even when you lock all the doors. He left almost everything to Meredith: the house, the accounts, the company shares. Chloe got a trust fund and property in Cape Cod. I got what was described as a modest inheritance and a tuition fund that barely covered my last year. No home, no heirloom, no letter, nothing that said I had ever been part of his future. Meredith said he wanted me to learn the value of independence. She smiled like it was a gift. Chloe didn't even pretend to hide her smirk. I walked out of that room knowing the truth. He had forgotten me too. I moved to Brooklyn with 2 suitcases, a stack of sketchbooks, and just enough in my bank account to cover rent for the first 3 months. My apartment was barely more than a box with a window, but it was mine. For the first time, I could leave dishes in the sink without anyone sighing behind me. The gallery wasn't glamorous. It sat between a laundromat and a coffee shop that never got the temperature of their lattes right. But it believed in small artists with big voices, and that was enough to keep me showing up, even when my feet ached from standing all day. I started as a part-time assistant, hanging canvases and logging inventory into spreadsheets with missing corners. On the slow days, I rearranged postcards at the front desk and made notes about which paintings got the longest stares. I never mentioned my last name unless paperwork forced me to. I lived on black coffee and discounted groceries and ignored the way my neighbors played loud music on weeknights. My walls were thin, but my space felt quiet. There was no one to impress, no one to disappoint, and that was a kind of freedom I hadn't known I needed. The gallery director, Dana, had a laugh like a burst balloon and a soft spot for artists with strange stories. She gave me room to grow. Slowly, I began curating small shows, writing blurbs for brochures, and speaking at open studios. I was learning how to make space for other people's voices while finding the shape of my own. I didn't talk about Meredith or Chloe. I didn't talk about the will or the cold way everything had ended. I told new friends my family was complicated and left it at that. The past felt like a museum I didn't visit anymore. Then one afternoon in March, it rained hard enough to make the walls sweat. I was alone at the gallery cataloging new sculpture pieces when the door chimed. He walked in with rain on his jacket and mud on his boots and paused in front of the first display like he had all the time in the world. He looked familiar in a way that tugged at something, but I couldn't place him. Tall, dark hair, still damp hands in his pockets. He smiled when I asked if he needed help and said he was just browsing, but his eyes lingered too long on the same piece to pretend. I told him about the artist, a woman from the Bronx who worked with discarded metal and old bicycle parts. I explained how her work was about reclaiming space in a city that often erased people like her. He listened like every word mattered. We wandered through the gallery together, and I forgot to check the time. He asked questions, real ones, not the usual surface-level collector fluff. I noticed how he nodded when he didn't speak and how he leaned in when he did. At the end, he thanked me and handed me a business card. That's when I realized who he was. Lucas Grant, CEO of a tech firm that had been in every magazine cover last fall. I tried not to let my surprise show, but I'm pretty sure he noticed anyway. He asked if we could talk more sometime, said he was interested in supporting the gallery and learning about up-and-coming artists. I said sure, thinking it would be a one-time coffee meeting, something polite, professional. It wasn't. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into long walks through the city where I told him about art and colors and why I still believed in paper instead of screens. He listened with that same quiet intensity. He told me about growing up in Ohio, about how he liked silence more than noise, and how he hated being told he was impressive. Lucas never asked about my last name. He never asked about where I came from or why I flinched when people mentioned parents. He talked to me like I was a whole person, not a project, not someone who needed fixing. There were moments in those early weeks when I caught myself waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for him to lose interest or for something to crack, but nothing did. He just kept showing up, with takeout on gallery nights and hot chocolate when the heater broke. He didn't ask for more than I was ready to give. When I hesitated, he gave space. When I opened up, he didn't flinch. It felt easy in a way that didn't scare me, like I could take a deep breath without bracing for impact. For the first time since my dad died, I felt like maybe I could belong somewhere. Not because someone made room for me, but because I built the door and opened it myself. Lucas didn't walk in to rescue me. He just met me where I was and offered to stay a while. And I didn't know it then. But that rainy afternoon was the moment everything started to change. Not with fireworks, not with promises, just with someone listening when I spoke and meaning it. Lucas was the kind of man who noticed things, not in the loud performative way people do when they want credit. He noticed when I was quiet for too long, when I skipped dinner without meaning to, when my shoulders tensed at the sound of certain names. He didn't ask why right away. He let me unfold on my own time like he knew forcing it would only make me retreat. I wasn't used to that kind of patience. We spent hours just talking about cities we wanted to visit, books we never finished, meals we remembered from childhood. He told me he used to build radios from scratch when he was 10, and once blew a fuse in his parents' garage trying to make a robot out of an old vacuum. I told him how I used to sketch in the margins of my notebooks during science class, how color always made more sense to me than numbers, how I used to believe silence meant I was doing something wrong. We built something slow and steady. I never had to perform or shrink. He never tried to impress me or fix me. He made space for me to exist without apology. The first time I invited him to my apartment, I warned him it was small. He said he didn't care. I offered to tidy up, but he said he liked it as it was because it looked lived in and real. He brought over takeout and sat on the floor with me eating pad thai out of the container while my heater clanked in the background. We talked until past midnight. I didn't want him to leave, but I didn't know how to say that without sounding needy. He stayed anyway, not because I asked, but because he wanted to. There was a night a few weeks later when the power went out. The wind howled through the windows and the candles I found barely lit the room. I sat on the couch wrapped in 2 blankets trying to hide the panic rising in my chest. Storms always reminded me of that first winter after my mom died. Lucas didn't ask questions. He sat beside me, handed me a flashlight, and told me the story of how his dad once climbed on the roof during a thunderstorm because their satellite dish came loose. I laughed without meaning to. That laugh felt like mine again. Eventually, I told him everything. Not in one sitting. It came in pieces. A memory here, a quiet confession there. He never interrupted. He didn't try to minimize what happened or tell me to forgive before I was ready. He just said it wasn't my fault, that people who are supposed to love you don't get to decide your worth by how useful or obedient you are, that being forgotten doesn't mean you're forgettable. His words didn't fix everything, but they loosened something in me. For the first time, I wasn't holding my pain alone. We didn't celebrate anniversaries with expensive gifts. He brought me coffee when I worked late. I left notes in his briefcase when he had early meetings. We built rituals out of ordinary moments. He never used his wealth to impress me. In fact, I didn't fully understand how powerful he was in his industry until much later. To me, he was just the man who remembered my favorite tea and always gave me the last dumpling. He told me once that real power isn't loud. It's quiet, stable, and generous. It doesn't need to be proven. I believed him because that was exactly how he loved me. I stopped flinching at kindness. I stopped apologizing for wanting things. Slowly, I stopped measuring myself by what Meredith and Chloe had taken from me. With Lucas, I wasn't broken or dramatic or hard to love. I was just me, and that was finally enough. The envelope was cream-colored with gold edging and thicker than most mail we received. It looked expensive, important, the kind of thing people send when they want you to feel small. I almost tossed it aside with the catalogs and credit card offers, but my name on the front made me pause. Inside was an invitation to the annual Winter Hearts Charity Gala, hosted by Meredith Whitmore and the Whitmore Family Foundation. There was a handwritten note paperclipped to the top that said, "We should reconnect, that the family missed me." I stared at it for a long time, not moving. Lucas came in from the kitchen holding 2 mugs, but he stopped when he saw my face. He set the mugs down and asked what it was, gently, like he already knew something was wrong. I handed him the invitation without a word. He scanned it once, then again, slower. I watched the way his jaw tightened and his brows pulled together. Then he looked up and said something that hit me harder than the paper ever could. "That's one of our events. My foundation is the primary donor this year. The gala's under an anonymous contribution, so Meredith doesn't know I'm connected. She definitely doesn't know you're my wife." I couldn't speak for a moment. The irony was too sharp, too strange. Meredith had invited me to a night funded by the man she once told me would never want someone like me. Lucas reached for my hand. He said I didn't have to go, that no one would blame me for ignoring it. That peace sometimes looks like silence, not confrontation. But something in me stirred, not anger exactly, but something deeper. The idea of walking into that room on my own terms, not as the outsider, not as the discarded daughter, just as me, as someone who had built a life worth showing up for. I asked him why his foundation stayed anonymous. He said it allowed them to focus on the cause instead of the press. He also admitted he hadn't looked too closely at the hosting committee this year. It had been handled by his team. I picked the invitation back up and traced the embossed lettering with my thumb. I wasn't interested in revenge. I didn't want a scene or some grand moment. I just wanted to see how it felt to be in that room and not shrink. Lucas said he would go if I wanted or stay behind if that made it easier. We talked it through for over an hour. We made a plan. I would arrive first. He would follow later after I had time to settle. We agreed not to reveal anything up front. No dramatic announcement, no forced confrontation. Just the truth revealed naturally if it came to that. That night, I stood at the window and watched the snow begin to fall. I thought about who I had been the last time I saw Meredith. Lost, small, still asking why. This time, I wasn't looking for answers. I just wanted to look her in the eye and feel nothing. The Rosebridge Hotel ballroom glowed with chandeliers and soft string music, the kind of setting meant to impress rather than comfort. I stepped through the entrance alone, handing my name to the woman at the check-in table, with a smile I hoped looked steadier than it felt. She tapped a tablet, nodded politely, and welcomed me to the event without hesitation. The crowd inside shimmered in tuxedos and satin gowns, conversations bubbling just above the music. I moved slowly through the room, brushing past people who looked familiar, only in the way that painful memories do. I had memorized every detail of this moment in my head, but reality felt sharper. My dress was deep green, tailored, understated. I had picked it carefully elegant, but not loud, a quiet declaration that I belonged here. Still, my heart beat harder than I wanted it to, as I searched for a place to stand that didn't feel exposed. I was doing fine until I heard my name spoken behind me, light and sharp like glass. I turned and saw Chloe first in a red gown that probably cost more than my rent, her smile already curving with something mean. Meredith stood beside her, hair perfectly styled, holding a champagne flute with the ease of someone used to owning the room. They looked me over once and I could feel the judgment settle on my skin like frost. Meredith stepped closer and tilted her head, speaking just loudly enough for the nearby group to hear. She asked if I was lost, said she didn't think staff were supposed to enter through the main doors. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. I said I had been invited, that my name was on the list, that I had every right to be here. Chloe's voice cut through mine, asking if I was helping pass hors d'oeuvres tonight. Meredith raised her hand, signaled to someone behind me, and said maybe I needed help finding the right exit. The security guard who appeared looked confused, but followed her lead. He asked for my credentials in a low voice. I tried to explain, tried to keep my voice calm, but I could feel the heat crawling up my neck. Around us, people turned away without really turning. No one said anything. I pulled the invitation from my clutch with shaking fingers, held it up like a lifeline. Meredith glanced at it and smiled, the kind of smile that always made me feel 12 again and invisible. She told the guard it must have been a courtesy copy, said they sent those to extended family sometimes, said it was understandable that I would misunderstand. The humiliation hit all at once, not just because she was lying, but because she was so practiced at it, because she had done this to me so many times before, and I had no one in that moment to say otherwise. Someone nearby whispered my name, followed by the word crash. Chloe took a picture. I stood there with my invitation in one hand and no dignity left in the other. I wasn't shaking because I was angry. I was shaking because I had thought even for a second that maybe this time would be different. The ballroom doors opened just as the security guard reached for my arm. The music didn't stop, but something in the room did. Heads turned slowly as Lucas walked in, calm, steady, and completely out of place in the middle of my humiliation. He wore a tailored black tux, the kind that made people stop and take notice before they even realized who he was. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on me. Then he crossed the room without hesitation, each step cutting through the whispers. He reached me in seconds and placed his hand gently on my back. Then he looked at the guard and asked what was going on, his voice low but firm. The security guard started to explain, glancing nervously toward Meredith and Chloe, who had both frozen mid-smirk. Meredith recovered first. She smiled like nothing had happened, called Lucas Mr. Grant, and said what a pleasant surprise it was to see him there. She tried to explain that there had been some confusion, a misunderstanding, nothing more. Lucas didn't smile back. He turned to the crowd, his voice just loud enough to carry. He said that Ava was not only a guest, but his wife. The room went quiet, so quiet I could hear my own breathing. Then he added that his foundation was the anonymous sponsor of the entire event. People gasped, not dramatically, just quietly enough that you could hear how much they hadn't seen this coming. Meredith's face paled. Chloe stepped back like the ground had shifted beneath her heels. Lucas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He said that no one should have to justify their presence in a room they were invited into, least of all his wife. He said it calmly, like it was obvious, like the conversation shouldn't have existed in the first place. The security guard apologized to me quietly and with a shame he couldn't hide. I nodded without speaking. Meredith tried to offer a quick explanation, said she hadn't known, said she would have treated things differently if she had. Lucas looked at her and said that was exactly the problem. That Ava's worth didn't depend on her name or who she was married to. That basic decency shouldn't be reserved for the powerful. I stood beside him, still holding the crumpled invitation, still shaking, but no longer from fear. For the first time in my life, someone stood between me and the people who had always tried to shrink me, and he did it without asking for anything in return. In the days after the gala, the emails came fast. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered we were family. Apologies arrived wrapped in flattery and excuses full of phrases like, "We had no idea and you should have said something sooner." I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because I knew what those messages were. They weren't regret. They were damage control. No one had spoken up when it mattered, and I had no interest in playing catch-up with people who only saw me when someone else shined a light. The silence I chose after the event felt different than the one I'd grown up with. It wasn't the kind that comes from being overlooked. This silence was mine. I chose it. And that made all the difference. Lucas never once told me what to do with them. He just kept showing up in the quiet, made dinner, let me vent, asked if I wanted to talk about it, and didn't push when I said not yet. A week after the gala, I got a letter in the mail from my Aunt Nora. She had always been on the sidelines, never cruel, but never present either. Her handwriting looked exactly like I remembered. The note was short. She said she was sorry, said she should have spoken up years ago, said she would understand if I didn't want to see her, but she hoped I might consider meeting for coffee. I waited 3 days before saying yes. We met at a small place near the gallery where the booths were deep and the lights were low. She looked nervous, older than I remembered. She didn't hug me, just smiled and said thank you. We talked slowly, like people circling something fragile. She admitted she had known what Meredith was doing, that she saw how I was treated differently, how I disappeared in plain sight. She said she stayed quiet because it felt safer, because she told herself it wasn't her place. I asked her why no one ever asked me what I needed. She said something I wasn't expecting, that after my mother died, my father was never the same, that he didn't stop loving me, but that he became someone who needed someone else to tell him what to do, that Meredith filled that space in his life and that he mistook control for comfort. She told me he kept pictures of me in his home office, not just the ones from when I was little, but ones I didn't even know he had. A photo from my high school art show, one from a student newspaper article about my work. He had saved them, hidden maybe, but saved. It didn't undo everything. It didn't explain the will or the cold distance or the years I spent wondering what I'd done wrong. But it gave me something I hadn't had before, proof that some part of him had still seen me. When I left the cafe, I didn't feel lighter exactly, but I felt more whole, like I had gathered another piece of myself back from a story that had always been told by someone else. Nora didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said she was sorry and meant it. That was enough. I went home that night and sat on the couch next to Lucas, my legs curled under me, my voice soft. I told him about the photos. He reached for my hand and held it without speaking. We didn't need words. We were quiet together, but not the lonely kind. That moment was when I realized I didn't need to reopen the door to my past. I just needed to stop blaming myself for the way it had closed. And once I did, I could finally breathe without holding anything back. We named it the Marisol Foundation, after my mother, after the woman who first put a paintbrush in my hand and told me that making something beautiful was always worth trying. Lucas and I launched it quietly, without press or galas or red carpets. Just a gathering of people who believed, like I did, that art could be a lifeline. We started with workshops in community centers, then built programs for kids in shelters and teens aging out of foster care. I taught the first class myself. My hands shook a little when I picked up the chalk, but the fear faded as soon as the first girl looked up and smiled. She had the same guarded eyes I used to see in the mirror. I told her it was okay to draw whatever she wanted, even if it was messy or didn't make sense yet. We don't measure success in gallery sales or portfolios. We measure it in quiet moments, in kids who stop clenching their shoulders when they walk into a room, in stories shared through color and shape when words feel too heavy. I still paint. Not to prove anything, not to be seen, just because it feels like breathing. My studio is small, sunlit, full of half-finished canvases and dried brushes and the kind of silence that feels like home. I don't hear from Meredith or Chloe anymore. Sometimes I wonder if they still talk about me, if they ever think of that night, but mostly I don't care. Their version of family never fit me anyway. Lucas and I are building something better. Not perfect, not polished, but honest. We have Sunday mornings that smell like coffee and rain. We have dinners where we argue over takeout and laugh when we're both wrong. I look at my life now and it feels like mine. Fully. Finally. I'm not who I was at 9 or 15 or even 28. I've grown past needing approval from people who made me disappear to feel bigger. My name is Ava Monroe Grant. I'm an artist, a wife, a woman who turned pain into purpose. And this time, when I stand in a room, I don't shrink. I take up space because I belong to myself now. If you've ever felt invisible, I want you to hear this. You're not imagining it. That ache in your chest, that quiet question in the back of your mind asking if maybe you're just too much or not enough, it's real. I know what it's like to sit at a table and feel like a guest in your own family. To be told your silence means peace when really it just means no one bothered to ask. I know how heavy it is to carry the weight of being the forgotten one. But I also know that healing doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like walking away. Sometimes it means building something beautiful from the scraps you were left with. You get to choose who matters. You get to choose who sees you, and you don't have to wait for permission to be whole. I found my strength in the moments no one was watching, in the quiet mornings alone in a tiny apartment, in the first time someone asked how I was and actually meant it. You don't have to prove your worth to people who only listen when someone else speaks for you. You don't have to stay where love comes with conditions. There is nothing wrong with you, and you are not alone. Tell your story even if your voice shakes. Find your people, the ones who show up without needing to be asked. Let go of the version of yourself that was shaped by their silence. You are allowed to be seen. You are allowed to be loud. You are allowed to take up space and still be loved. So, if you've ever felt like I did, I hope you know this. There is life on the other side of being unseen. And when you get there, I promise it's worth it.